Hello, everyone. Welcome to Bay Area Book Festival Unbound, the virtual version of the annual festival based in Berkeley, California. I'm Sherilyn Parsons, founder and director of the festival. We're delighted to present Entangled Life, what the secret social networks of fungi reveal about nature's genius and being human, with Merlin Sheldrake and Michael Pollan. Their conversation will be introduced by Louie Schwartzberg, director of the amazing documentary, Fantastic Fungi. So, how can you not be intrigued by someone named Merlin? Merlin Sheldrake has a PhD in tropical ecology from Cambridge University, and he brings literature, music, philosophy, even spiritual and political inquiry to bear on his mind-blowing explorations of these life forms called fungi, which have a lot to teach us at a precarious time for human civilization. Merlin is our fungi whisperer, and today we celebrate his gorgeous and important first book, Entangled Life. In conversation with Merlin is Michael Pollan, who was telling people about Merlin's book even before it was published. For 30 years, Michael has been writing about the places where nature and culture intersect on our plates, in our farms and gardens, and in our minds. His many best-selling books include The Botany of Desire and The Omnivore's Dilemma. Most relevant on the mushroom front, or the shroom front, is his recent book, How to Change Your Mind, What the New Science of Psychedelics Teaches Us About Consciousness, Dying, Addiction, Depression, and Transcendence. As anyone knows who has seen his documentary, Fantastic Fungi, Louie Schwartzberg is a cinematic magician. Louie is a director, producer, and cinematographer who conjures breathtaking images through his time-lapse, high-speed, and macro cinematography, all aimed at celebrating life and revealing the mysteries and wisdom of nature, people, and places. In addition to Fantastic Fungi, now available online, his work has ranged from IMAX screens to theme parks and Netflix, where his moving art series is in season 3. More than 60 million people have viewed his TED Talks, and we're thrilled to have him with us in person today to open this event. So Louie, take it away.
Thank you, Sherilyn. It's great to be here with you, with all of you. I'm Louie Schwartzberg, and what I love to do is I love to take audiences on journeys through time and scale, making the invisible visible, which is why I'm really thrilled to introduce you to a groundbreaking conversation with Michael Pollan and Merlin Sheldrake, talking about Merlin's new book, Entangled Life, How Fungi Can Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds, and Shape Our Future. I've known them for many years, and they both contributed to Fantastic Fungi film and the companion book. But before we take you on a deep underground mycelial dive, here's a little mushroom appetizer to share with all of you to get our juices flowing. Play the video. So Michael Pollan is a dear friend of mine and a brilliant writer whose books break all kinds of boundaries of conventional thinking. One of my favorites is Botany of Desire. His books expand your horizons by writing about, books, how a plant-eye view of the world can really shift your perspective. I think Michael and I have both been seduced by plants. I think we're both slaves to our garden, which is why the giant question always emerges in this book: who's controlling who? It's this relationship of plants that I think has got me seduced to filming time-lapse flowers in my studio nonstop, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for over 40 years, which I've compressed into 16 hours of film. In the process of making Wings of Life, a Disney nature film about pollinators, I realized that if plant and pollinators are the foundation of life, well, what do plants need? Well, they need soil, which led me to making Fantastic Fungi. Michael was one of the first experts that I interviewed about fungi and how they can heal the planet, your body, your mind, and your soul. His best-selling book, How to Change Your Mind, has brought the conversation of psychedelics and sacred medicines into the mainstream conversation. And for that, we're all deeply grateful. Merlin Sheldrake is another expert I interviewed in my film. I first met Merlin and his family at the annual summer gatherings on Cortes Island in British Columbia. Merlin has an extraordinary family. His father, Rupert, is a mind-bending biologist and author, and his brother Cosmo is a brilliant musician-composer who scored my Galapagos episode on Moving Art on Netflix. Merlin's amazing book, Entangled Life, is a portal to what, until recently, has been a hidden kingdom of life, the dazzling, peculiar domain of fungi. Merlin's a young, intellectually rigorous, and brilliant, imaginative biologist who challenges our understanding of life on Earth, not only with startling facts about fungi's role in psychedelics, medicine, ecology, and manufacturing, but by lending us a means to see the world from a radically different fungal perspective. Today's conversation is going to shift your perspective because you're never going to look at fungi the same way. Or will you look at nature and life the same way? I think forever your perspective will be changed. So here is a great underground conversation with Michael Pollan and Merlin Sheldrake.
Thank you so much, Louie. And you really did set the table with that beautiful clip. It's amazing the power of time-lapse to make us feel the agency of species that to us seem kind of slow. I'm here for one reason. I mean, one is I support the Berkeley Book Festival and the work Sherilyn's been doing, but mainly because I fell in love with this book, Entangled Life. I met Merlin for the first time in London, I believe it was, last December when I was there on book tour. And we got together in my hotel lobby, and I was just kind of excited to read this book, and the book completely rewarded that excitement and lived up to all my expectations. Merlin's a very unusual writer in that he is a scientist with the imagination of a poet, a beautiful writer, a book that is not just to be, I mean, there's a lot of information that was mind-blowing, and you'll hear some of that today, but nothing short of the literary experience will really acquaint you with what is here. So I hope you'll accept this offering as only a small piece of everything on offer in Entangled Life. Merlin, before we get, I do want to talk a little bit about your background and how you got into this, but I want to ask you perhaps a harder, more cosmic question first. The fungal kingdom seems to be having a moment culturally right now. There is not only Louie's wonderful movie, but and the interest in psilocybin research, which is exploding to treat mental illness and learn about consciousness. And there's the success of your book. So I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts as to why do you think, I mean, fungi, as I pronounce it, forgive me, are below or beneath notice. They're underground most of the time, but they seem to be fruiting right now. And I wonder if you have any thoughts as to why this is a moment where we're very fixed on this particular and somewhat obscure kingdom.
It's a good question, and I thought about it myself as well because I've ended up writing this book, and I was wondering how it found me and how the subject found me. And I think there's a few reasons. One of them is technological, that we have these new technologies like DNA sequencing that allow us to make available this world, which is out of sight and out of our reach. Fungi live their lives as these networks for the most part, or as microscopic cells like yeasts, and they're hidden from view. And when they're mycelial networks, they're buried in their food, and so we can't see them. We see them only as mushrooms, and that's an ephemeral sight. So part of it is technological, that we simply we can make further inroads into this kingdom than we could before. Also, though, I think there's a general ecological turn going on, and people are realizing how interconnected we are with the more than human world, with these living systems that support us and sustain all that we depend on. And fungi are interconnected organisms fundamentally. They make literal the principle of ecology, these relationships between organisms. They form literal connections between organisms. So I think part of it is also this ecological turn and this greater interest in how things connect, which is also related to the digital networks that we find ourselves surrounded by, and the rise of network science since the mid-90s. And networks now become this master concept that we use to explain many, many things. And so I think the network nature of fungi is another thing that has caught that network wind. These ancient networks, possibly the most ancient living networks on this planet. So, and then there's the crises and the ecocidal, runaway ecocidal tendencies. And I think these fungal solutions, of which there are many, offer some hope in this time of crisis and coming to terms with the fact that we live on a very damaged planet. And so all of these things, I think, contribute.
And I want to talk about each of them in turn, actually, later. I also think that the interest in the soil and the growing recognition of how important soil is to everything from the quality of the food we eat, but to solving climate change has focused us a little more underground, where, of course, where most of the action is when you're talking about the fungi. I want to, before we talk a little bit about what brought you from plants to fungi, and as you say, you study the social networks of plants, a very striking phrase. It would be helpful, I think, if you could just give us a little primer, because most of us know mushrooms, and we assume we're talking about mushrooms with a fancy word, fungi, but in fact, mushrooms are just the tip of the iceberg, if you will. So will you just define a few terms: mushroom, fungi, mycorrhizal, mycelium, and hyphae? That would be really helpful.
Of course. So start with mushrooms, because they're the things that we see the most. We see on our supermarket shelves. Mushrooms are the fruiting bodies of fungi, so the equivalent to apples or flowers, actually, as well. So these ephemeral structures that arise to serve some kind of physiological purpose, to do with dispersal and to do with mating. So they're a transitory organ of fungi, and fungi are most fungi spend most of their time as mycelial networks. So this is termed mycelium, which means this living, growing, fusing network of tubular cells, which is how fungi feed. They put themselves in their food. They insinuate themselves into their food. We put food in our bodies. Fungi do it the other way around. And mycelium is how they do that. Because the world is unpredictable, they have to be able to pour themselves into their environment, whatever shape their environment must be. So they have this great fluidity and flexibility. And so mycelium is this living, growing speculation in bodily form. And mycelium is made up of these tubular cells, which are called hyphae. So a single fungal cell is called a hypha, plural hyphae. And hyphae tangle and branch and fuse to form this anarchic filigree of mycelium. And there are other ways to be a fungus. Some fungi live as single-celled, like yeast. They don't form these elaborate networks in the same way. And so, but most fungi live most of their lives as networks. Only a small minority produce mushrooms, and only about a small fraction of one of the great divisions of the fungal kingdom. So mushrooms are just
Can we see mycelium?
You can see mycelium if you grow it in a... you can grow it on a plate and in a lab, and you can grow it. You can see mycelium on bread when you have moldy bread, and you can see it on rotting logs if you peel back the bark or the top layer. But most of it will always remain out of sight. We can overcome that using experimental techniques, but it's necessarily inside its environment.
Which is part of the reason that it's more difficult for us to grok, right, than plants, which have this very familiar architecture, and fungi don't, right? I mean, and they're also hard to they're harder to study, right? I mean, don't they kind of fall apart when you try to bring a mycelial network out of the earth?
Exactly. That was one of the things I'd always struggle with. And I'm trying to study these living networks, and I dig a hole and gone, dead, And so I didn't take them back and grind them up and extract the DNA or their fats. But you're always one step removed, at least if you're studying fungi in the soil. So this is one of the things. They're hard to reach. And it's exactly this hard to reachness which makes them so ubiquitous, because it means they can go to so many places. We can actually see a very small part of the living world. So much of it takes place beneath the surface of the earth.
Mm. So you came to fungi through plants. You were a tropical ecologist. I know where you worked. I've been to Barro, Colorado, and spent a memorable day there. This is in Panama, in the canal. It's an amazing place where most of what we know about tropical ecology, I think, is based on that. Let's hope it's typical. And actually, we share a friend, Christian Ziegler, who you mentioned in the book, who he and I had a wonderful adventure looking for deceptive orchids together, and he photographed them, and I wrote about them. But tell me a little bit about your path into plants, and then from plants to fungi.
So I've been into fungi for a while in different forms, and into fermentation and with yeast, and into rotting and decomposition, and so I'm into mushrooms and growing mushrooms as a child, and so I've always been interested in fungi. But I really got interested when I realized how fundamental they are to the lives of plants. And the plants are really algae which have evolved to farm fungi, and fungi that have evolved to farm algae. There's this reciprocal dependence that plants have on fungi, and yet you really can't think about the lives of plants without thinking about the fungi that live in their roots, that fan out from their roots in these laced networks through the soil, that throng in their leaves and in their stalks. All plant cells, almost all parts of their bodies are surrounded by fungi. So this is a very ancient part of planthood, actually a more ancient part of planthood than leaves, wood, flowers, fruit. Fungi were deeply involved in the movement of algae onto land in the first place, and this very beginning of the lineage of land plants. So I realized that this was the case, that plants meant plants and fungi, really, if you're thinking about them in context and as living organisms rather than as cells or molecular networks within cells. So then I realized that this was fascinating, and because relatively little is known, much less is known about them than plants, I was intrigued. And
how long has it been since we discovered that relationship, the mycorrhizal relationship with plants?
Well, these fungi were observed on plant roots through the 19th century, but before the word symbiosis was coined, there was no way to conceive of a relationship involving the sharing of intimate bodily space that wasn't parasitic or pathogenic. So it was actually in 1885 this word mycorrhiza was coined by a guy called Albert Frank, a sort of visionary. He was the guy who coined the word symbiosis a few years before. And
so you needed that concept in order to understand that phenomenon.
Well, yes, because you could think of them as these root parasites, which is how people had thought about them. And Frank said, no, that's more like a wet nurse. They enable the nourishment of the tree from the soil. And people thought he was a lunatic. Now, how is this possible? He had all these skeptics thundering on, and these people who believed firmly in a Western industrial capitalistic vision of competition in nature. So it was then 1885, and then since then the study has developed, and they've popped in and out of popular consciousness. They were a big thing for Albert Howard, who was one of the early pioneers of the organic movement in the mid 20th century.
Can plants live without their fungal partners? Can they survive?
Some plants, so about 90% of plants form these relationships with mycorrhizal fungi. The 10% or so don't. Those are usually the ones that have more specific nutritional strategies, like carnivorous plants, or plants that live in very, very, very extreme soils. And have evolved not to have them. The cabbage family actually don't form typical mycorrhizal associations, and that's always been a strange anomaly for researchers. Now, why don't they do that? But it's becoming clear that fungi, plants that don't form formal mycorrhizal relationships, nonetheless form relationships with fungi in their roots that play a similar kind of role. All plants, however, have fungi in their leaves and their stems. No plant has been found without them.
And you can grow things hydroponically, right? In reinforced water. Is there a fungal relationship going on there or not?
Yeah, there is. If you grow from sterile seeds, then you won't have that. But these mycorrhizal fungi actually play a big part in hydroponic growth systems if you choose to open them up to that.
Right. So I want to go back to this phrase you use in the book that you alluded to earlier, which is that you study the social networks of plants. And you use this metaphor, well, you didn't invent it, and you have some critical things to say about it, but it's also quite powerful, of the wood wide web. Will you talk a little bit about these social networks and the role they play?
Yes. So an individual plant can form a relationship with an individual fungus that will fan out from its roots, which will scavenge nutrients from the soil and water from the soil and pass them back to the plant in exchange for energy-containing carbon compounds that the plants make in photosynthesis. So if you have one plant and one fungus, then you have this kind of arrangement. But because you never have one plant and one fungus in the natural world, you have many plants and many fungi in a given locale. And the fungi are promiscuous, and they can form relationships with more than one type of plant, more than one individual plant. And plants are also promiscuous and can form relationships with more than one fungus. And what that means is you have these open, overlapping networks where you can have multiple plants joined by a single fungal network. And normally you have more than a single fungal network joining multiple plants. So then you end up with this kind of a social network situation where plants are coupled together underground. And things can, these networks can make a real difference. Material can pass between plants in certain situations. You can have... Can
you give an example of plants pooling nutrients or sharing them or swapping them using this network?
Mm-hmm. So the work of Suzanne Simard in BC has been really fundamental to this field, and she really got this going. She was the first person to show that you could have the interplant transfer of nutrients in a natural setting, outside. And she showed that you can have radioactively labeled carbon that can pass from a larger tree or a less shaded tree, a donor plant, she calls it, to a receiver plant. And if you shade the receiver plants, increasing its need for carbon, then more carbon will pass to the receiver plant. And it's a very simple version of it, and it can become more and more complicated. And it's not the same in all types of network. You could have different types of mycorrhizal fungus, and they can actually have a negative effect on plants coupled in networks. You can have large plants can extract more than their fair share of nutrients from the network, and so some plants actually benefit when they're cut off from the network because they're not being taxed by these larger plants that can pull harder on the fungus.
Now, this whole idea of a social plant network kind of relegates the fungus to plumbing, which I know is is one of your problems with the metaphor. But will you talk a little bit about so who benefits? Cui bono? I mean, when we look at something like this, we can see what the plants get out of it. What did the fungi get out of it?
Yeah, the cui bono is really the question. It's a really helpful question because it's very easy to get stuck with the plant-centric view. In the field, there's these debates that range. The mycocentrists, they're like, no, the fungus is the node, and the plants are the links in the network. And the phytocentrists say, no, the plants are the nodes, and the fungi are the links. And the fact is that the wood wide web is a phytocentric metaphor because it makes the fungi seem like the cables, and the plants seem like the routers, the hubs of information. So, of course, that's not the case, and many phenomena in these networks don't make sense unless you start thinking about the fungus as active participants in this situation. And so when you have material passing from one plant to another, and it raises these problems with altruism. Modern evolutionary theory doesn't cope well with altruism because an altruist gives at a cost to themselves, and if an altruist is giving at a cost to themselves, then they're less likely to pass on their genes to the next generation. So altruism is a sort of an ever-present notion when discussing these ideas of cooperation in nature. And you can get around that problem by making the fungus the active party, because if it benefits a fungus to have multiple plant partners, a portfolio of plant partners, it insures it against the loss of one or the other, or any of the others. So you can have a situation where the fungus is a kind of broker of entanglement, funneling nutrients between plants to keep its portfolio in the healthiest state, because it benefits the fungus. And then you get around the problem of altruism, because it's not the plant being the agent who's doing the giving, it's the fungus who's doing the redistribution. So that's quite a fun way to invert the Wood Wide Web story and to challenge us to think of it from another point of view.
Yeah, I mean, one of the book has a whole subtext, which is really about language and concepts and metaphors in particular, their power, their necessity, that all scientists use metaphor to conceive of what they're up to and imagine, but that metaphors can mislead too. One of the really striking takeaways from your book, and it's almost an agenda, I think, of your book, or an argument, which is a real critique of the idea of the individual in biology, and that's a very limited way to understand things, as this, whether you're talking about human-centric or plant-centric, but it seems to me fungi force us to rethink some of our assumptions about individuality. Would you, is that a fair gloss on what you're saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think really the whole biological world does. We have these concepts of individuals because it suits us, and it suits the systems that we make to order and govern our lives. And fair enough, it's helpful to have units with which we can think, with which we can add and subtract. So I don't blame us in the slightest. But the trouble is when you start to try and draw firm lines in the more than human world, and then the lines start to blur. And then if you keep trying to maintain those lines in the face of this blurring, in the face of this flux and change, then you start to walk out on some really shaky ground, and we can make contortions to try and support our story, rather than just ditch it in that instance and realize that actually the individual is not helping us in that moment. So I think of it like that. So we need individuals sometimes, but usually it depends on what level we're discussing. If you're thinking about the cells in a mycelial network, if you look at the growing tips, they look like they behave, they change their direction of growth, they speed up, they slow down, they branch, they fuse. These are the units of a mycelial swarm, to use that analogy. But it breaks down when you look at the whole network, because you realize that all these tips are connected together in a single network. So it sort of flickers between a whole and a collection of parts. And I think many things in the natural world do. We're made up of all these microbes, and we carry around more microbial cells than our own, and without which we couldn't do the things we do and behave the ways we do. So even in our own bodies, this idea of individuality is being challenged the more that we uncover these small relationships taking place on the microscopic scale.
And of course, along with this idea of individuality is agency, right? It raises questions, but also you bring your models, and so we have a lot of trouble understanding a system as decentralized as mycelium. That we have a very brain-centric or neurocentric idea. And what these fungi suggest, and certain plants do too, is that there's another way to organize, or another way to direct behavior. And one of the really interesting things you do in the book is try to get us to think in a different way that displaces that idea that you need a central headquarters, literally. And so how do mycelium make decisions in the absence of a brain or anything remotely like a brain?
It's a really active, live question, and no one has a good answer. Because we lack aware, we have capital cities, we have heads of state. So we organize our lives and our systems with this head model. We're cerebrocentric, and we're proud of our brains, and we like thinking about brains.
Rightly so.
And brains are great. I have no problem with brains. But it does mean that we get confused when we start looking at organisms which don't seem to have a centralized place where they connect perception with action, where they integrate information. So when we look at a fungal network, there's different places. There's hyphal tips, there's junctions, but there's many of everything. And so it's difficult to try and find a place where this is all taking place. And so really the answer is it's happening everywhere at once and nowhere in particular. But that's also confusing for us. So, but in reality, there are lots of things going on. Fungi they pass chemicals through their networks, which have signaling roles or play as cues. They have flow. They have these rivers of cellular fluid moving through fungal networks, which, and flow itself can be a cue. These are not static systems. They are flow forms, really. And so chemicals can flow itself, changes in pressure, because it's one continuous hydraulic network. A change in pressure exerted in one place could potentially be felt everywhere else, like a car braking system. That's one possibility. Electrical signaling is another possibility that's just beginning to be investigated and possibly allows for this fast communication through fungal networks by pulsing electrical impulses, analogous to the nerve impulses that pass through our body. So sometimes I think about fungal networks as more like, rather than having a brain, they're more like a brain. The whole network is more like a brain distributed around in its environment. And maybe that would help us get over our struggle, because we could use a brain analogy and think of the whole network as a brain-like structure, but just diffusely arranged.
Yeah, although that's very tendentious. I know in the plant world, when a group of people who were promoting the idea of plant intelligence, which I think is completely reasonable, called themselves the Society for Plant Neurobiology, people went nuts. That there are no neurons, so how can you possibly use the word neurobiology? And you keep bumping up into the limitations of our language. So let's talk a little bit about some of these powers that fungi have. I mean, we use words, some people will use words like consciousness. Some people will use words like, you used the word awareness, I think, a little while ago, intelligence, decision-making. Where are you comfortable and where do you get uncomfortable when you talk about the capabilities of a fungal network?
Good question. It's something I'm always exploring and playing with. And I think if we don't do that, certainly if I don't do that, then I get locked in my thinking and I stop really learning how to understand these organisms that are so different from us. So I find it's helpful to use these terms and see how it works. What does it do to the way I imagine? What does it do to the way I think? What does it do to the way I discuss this subject? To use this term that's potentially borrowed from the human world, potentially more comfortable around animals that have brains. But really, I think what we're dealing with here, with these are feeling bodies. They are sensing, feeling bodies. They have data streams, all sorts of data streams flowing through their networks. They're sensitive to light, to pressure, temperature, pH, all these things. All these stimuli from the environment generate sense data, which passes through the network and has got to be integrated somehow, someplace, for them to make certain decisions. And decisions happen whenever you have options. So decisions is wedded to the brain concept. There's an amazing researcher called Michael Levin, whose work I like a lot at Tufts University, and he says that brains didn't evolve their tricks from scratch. Brains have these capabilities, neurons have these capabilities because this is a fundamental feature of living, of livingness. Bacterial colonies can have electrical waves of electrical activity that pass over them, and they're used for communication and signaling. So brains are just a very specialized, a sped up version of these basic biochemical processes, which most organisms use to organize themselves some way, somehow. So I think it's important to think of them as feeling bodies. That's on a very basic level.
Feeling in you don't mean in the sense of emotion, you mean in the sense of sensing.
Sensing, yeah. Sensing bodies. They can affect changes in their environment.
Do they have experience?
That's a very good question. I mean, this is a big question in the biology more generally. And experience, well, I just try and break it down to if you do something to the fungus, then it detects it and it changes its behavior in response to that stimulus. And whether it is aware of that, and if it was aware of that experience, then you would say that it had some kind of subjective, some kind of consciousness. And I have absolutely no idea whether they have consciousness. I mean, it's very hard to know when anything else is conscious. With humans, they can tell you, so you can have some way of finding out. But I think of them as sensing, as experiencing, in the sense that they are open to the sensory potential of their environments.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the really exciting and disturbing things about your book is cases where you see mycelium or fungi manipulating animals. And there's one particular story of the Ophiocordyceps, which is one of the most horrifying relationships in nature. I mean, it's about as horrific as anything that I've seen in nature. And you've got a wonderful passage describing this. I guess we can call it a relationship. But will you read a passage? Because I just love that story. And lest we romanticize the fungal kingdom too much, this is very much the dark side.
Absolutely. Very grisly. The most prolific and inventive manipulators of animal behavior are a group of fungi that live within the bodies of insects. These zombie fungi are able to modify their host's behavior in ways that bring a clear benefit. By hijacking an insect, the fungus is able to disperse its spores and complete its life cycle. One of the best studied cases is that of the fungus Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, which organizes its life around carpenter ants. Once infected by the fungus, ants are stripped of their instinctive fear of heights, leave the relative safety of their nests, and climb up the nearest plant, a syndrome known as summit disease. In due course, the fungus forces the ant to clamp its jaws around the plant in a death grip. Mycelium grows from the ant's feet and stitches them to the plant's surface. The fungus then digests the ant's body and sprouts a stalk out of its head, from which spores shower down on ants passing below. If the spores miss their targets, they produce secondary sticky spores that extend outwards on threads that act like tripwires. Zombie fungi control the behavior of their insect hosts with exquisite precision. Ophiocordyceps compels ants to perform the death grip in a zone with just the right temperature and humidity to allow the fungus to fruit, a height of 25 centimeters above the forest floor. The fungus orients ants according to the direction of the sun, and infected ants bite in synchrony around noon. They don't bite any odd spot on the leaf's underside. 98% of the time, the ants clamp onto a major vein.
So that raises all sorts of interesting questions. I mean, what this fungus is doing, is changing the mind of the insect, right? It's changing its behavior. It's drugging it, and of course that raises the obvious question: does this happen to us as well when we ingest certain kinds of fungus? As you know, there's been a conversation going on for several decades about the role of psilocybin mushrooms in human consciousness, and there are people in the mycological community who are convinced that that psychedelic experience represents some sort of agenda on the part of the fungal world. I know I'm taking you further out on the fringes than you go in the book, but you do write about psychedelics in really interesting ways, reviewing some of the research. But you also had a psychedelic trip that you describe in the introduction. Apropos of what, I'm not entirely sure, but you participated in a perfectly legal LSD experiment. And I'm curious to know, and LSD, of course, is derived from a fungus, ergot. I'm curious what psychedelic experience might have to teach us about this world, the fungal world.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot we can learn, because one of the things that psychedelics do, as this new wave of studies that's happening in the last few years has been very clear about, is it can dissolve this sense of distinction that we have with the world around us. It can make us get confused about where our boundaries lie, where we start and the world stops. And some people call this ego dissolution. Some people just call it a mystical experience, a sense of dissolving, of losing track of ourselves. And so I think that's a really good way to go about learning to imagine how decentralized organisms that can fuse and grow in these non-indeterminate ways, how these organisms might go about living their lives. So I find that very helpful, a decentering of my consciousness. And my consciousness is not located in a concentration, which a local concentrated point in time and space, the me that can talk about me, but somehow diffuses and my awareness spreads out. And that I found very, very interesting and has definitely helped me to think about these organisms.
So in a way, the mushroom experience underwrites the critique of individuality, right? I mean, that there's if the mushrooms are sending us any sort of message through the experiences they sponsor in our minds, it tends in the direction of challenging our sense of autonomy and individuality and suggesting that we're more deeply interconnected than we thought.
Absolutely, yeah. And of course, we are more deeply interconnected than we thought. So,
one of the things that struck me about having some of these experiences myself is that these epiphanies that we write off as drug-induced epiphanies contain these fantastic kernels of truth about the way the world works. Mm-hmm. And so that there is solid information, whether it's being sent, from nature to teach us or not, is to go a little bit further. But certainly there are these wonderful elements of truth here. Mm-hmm. And so when you participated in this LSD experiment, what exactly, is this what you got out of it, or why did you do it? And and what was it like?
I did it because there was a poster on the wall of the plant sciences department in Cambridge, and it said, "Do you have a meaningful problem that needs solving?" And I thought, of course. Yeah. It was a great advertisement. And it said, if you do, and if you'd like to take part in an LSD study, then call this number. So I called the number. I wasn't sure whether this was a stupid thing to do or a very clever thing to do, but in the end, I'm glad I did it. And the study was a study to investigate the effects of psychedelics, of LSD in particular, on the problem-solving abilities of scientists. And they were repeating a study that had been done in the 60s, and they wanted to find out whether it helped scientists approach old problems from new angles, whether these knots that in their inquiries they'd been fumbling with, whether this LSD could help those knots to loosen, to help them to learn to imagine their way around this problem in a way that perhaps they hadn't been before. And of course, so it's often the case with problems that you're banging on the front door and realize you can just walk around the side. It's like a theatre flat, just go in the back door. You didn't think to go in the back door. So this was the logic of the experiment, and I found it very helpful. I was thinking about the ways that plants.
So did you go into it with a question?
Yeah, they were very careful to get us to think about our work-related problem. That's what they called it. We had to define this work-related problem. And then sometime during the trip, when we'd reached cruising altitude, as they said, then we each had an assistant. We each in our own room. And the assistant gently said, maybe do you feel like starting to think about your work-related problem? And I was like, my work-related problem?
Do I have to?
And then we had little desks, and there were colored pencils and pads of paper on the desk, everything you might need to think about your work-related problem. And so I just thought about, I didn't want to do any drawing or paper work, so I just sat on the bed and imagined, and had a wonderful time imagining. And
what were you working on?
I was thinking about this relationship between a certain type of plants that have lost the ability to photosynthesize, and so they're pale white, they don't have leaves, and the fungi that sustain them. And I wanted to think about what the plant could be giving back to the fungus, because normally the plant is thought of as a parasite, as something that takes but doesn't give. And I wondered if that was true, and I just assumed that it was true, but I just wanted to think about it in new ways. And so I ended up having this experience, and I sort of felt like I went onto the soil. It was very vivid, and I felt this bustling, heaving activity, like a kind of Wild West. And it was very engaging. I was totally compelled. And of course, no, these are not factual observations. These are wild visions. But afterwards, I felt like I had been reminded by this experience to not to forget that these organisms are in a shimmering state of activity, a constant process of turnover and engagement. And it's very easy to forget that when you're dealing with microbes, because you draw little pictures of them with blobs or little schematic networks with this kind of digital logic. And you forget that this is a heaving wilderness, and that we just can't ever see. And every time we measure it, we capture it at a moment. So we forget that it's a process. We forget that it's a wild place. So that was what was helpful for me. Besides, it was just an enjoyable experience and a very amusing as well to be in a hospital in this state.
I can imagine. I think that goes back to that point we made at the very beginning, which is that it's hard for us to see this world because it unfolds at a different scale, in terms of time, especially, and place, in the case of fungi. But that so much goes on that our senses are just simply not calibrated to take in. And one of the interesting things about psychedelics is it can change that scale, that time scale, and allow us imaginatively to enter into these worlds. One last question before we go to questions from the audience, and I know there are quite a few. A question I grapple with in my book and didn't really come to any conclusion is, in the case of psilocybin, why does this set of species, and there are quite a few that produce this chemical, this psychoactive chemical, what's in it for the fungi to make this stuff? What function does it perform? Does it do it? It doesn't do it to get us to get humans to trip, I doubt. But do we know?
No, it's been speculated about for ages. There are some cases in the plant world, as you discuss in your book so well, where there's things like caffeine. It's very clear that this is an anti-herbivore deterrent. It stops the insects from being interested in eating the plant. And so people have speculated a similar thing for psilocybin. Could this be a deterrent to stop fungivores from coming along and eating the mushrooms? But it doesn't really hold up that well, because there are lots of insects that eat the mushrooms perfectly happily. There's a certain type of gnat that makes its home in these fungi, and of course it's not poisonous to animals like humans and other mammals. So the poison theory is it could work for some organisms. Maybe for some organisms it's a deterrent, but not for all. So then it's possible that you have this kind of arms race, and the most likely story right now is that it originally arose as a deterrent. Some organisms became resistant to it as a deterrent, and then you go from there. Some people say it was a lure, that it somehow changed animal behavior, insect behavior in particular. This was about 75 million years ago, that it thought that the first mushroom became magic. That it could change the animal behavior in a way that benefited the fungus somehow. Some types of leafcutter ant have been observed to forage for these mushrooms and carry them back to their nest in one piece. We don't know why. So maybe it could be a lure, but if it was a lure, how would it be changing their behavior in a way that was beneficial to the fungus? So we don't know. It might not have been doing very much at all. You can have chemicals that accumulate in these metabolic backwaters, playing Z-list roles as metabolic intermediates, so-called secondary compounds, as you know, and as you discuss in the Botany of Desire. And but what's certain is that as soon as they encountered humans, and particularly this encounter that happened with Western scientists in the 20th century, in the 20th century, their evolutionary fortunes have transformed. So these mushrooms are now cultivated. It's a new story of domestication, spread around the world, cultivated. We've worked very hard to find new ways to cultivate them, all because this psilocybin has become a glittering lure for us. It's become this astonishing lure. So what might once have served to fuddle the wits of insect pests has suddenly flipped in our hands. So we just don't know. It's probably a mixture of lure, a mixture of deterrent, maybe sometimes neither. some fungi used psilocybin to, some fungi that infect insects, cicadas, produce psilocybin, suggests that they have some manipulative role. So there will be
That's another horrific story. Right?
Another one. I mean, there are so many of them.
And that this particular fungus infects cicadas and does something truly horrible to their posterior. That we'll leave it to the readers to discover. But yeah, that's a recent finding that is mind blowing. Well, Sherilyn's got some questions from people in the audience. So why don't we turn to them and see what they want to know? Sherilyn?
Hi there. Yes, we have 54 questions. So I know people are very engaged, which is terrific. Here's one that's pretty straightforward. Daniel asks, is there evidence of fungal plant communication over long distances? Or perhaps I should ask, what is the distance that fungi plants have been found to communicate or share nutrients?
Good question. So you could think about that in a couple of ways. I'm assuming that you mean plants connected to fungi with actual persistent connections rather than fungi producing, say, volatile compounds that diffuse through the air and affect plants. So most of these studies have taken place in controlled settings, in which case, because you don't have much space in the greenhouse, you're not testing how far this can go. People have found monitored connections in the field and found that these networks can spread over meters, over tens of meters, but it's not been proved in that case that the materials are passing between plants over that distance. We know that fungi can spread over huge distances. So armillaria, for example, the honey fungus, has been found to spread over 10 square kilometers. Somewhere in Oregon is one of the largest organisms in the world. That infects dead plants and dying plants. It kills plants. And this fungal network has to communicate with itself to be a coherent network. And so we can assume that where you have a coherent network, a contiguous network, that this is communicating with itself. So the answer is we're not sure how far this can go because we haven't done that kind of study. The chances are it's further than we think.
Sherilyn? I think we've lost.
Hi, I'm sorry. Okay, there. Yeah, I can't unmute myself directly here. Okay, so here's another direct question before we get into some of the larger, more metaphysical. How practical is the use of mycoremediation on a large scale as a technique for cleaning up large toxic spills and so on?
This is a really important question. Mycoremediation is the use of fungi, deploying fungi with their voracious appetites to metabolize compounds that we have polluted the environment with. And there's lots of ways that fungi can do this. You can have fungi growing in an environment and breaking down a toxin. You can have fungi growing in an environment and sequestering heavy metals. You can have fungi used as kind of filters, mycofiltration. So it's the subject of research and a great interest, and it's not simple a solution because these are organisms with their needs and wants, and they have to be cultivated essentially in an environment. You can't just throw a fungus into a heap of plastic and expect it to just break it down. When you find fungi growing in these environments, they're surrounded by an ecology of other microbes which may play key roles in different steps in the decomposition process. So much more work is needed. It's difficult to do this work because the field of remediation is unreformed, and it involves usually scraping up soil, taking it somewhere else and burning it. And to develop mycoremediation solutions, you have to think about that particular site. What do we need right here? What kind of fungi, what kind of community do we need right here? And so it's more bespoke, it's more fiddly, and a lot more study is needed, but certainly the potential is there for these organisms to solve all sorts of problems for us. I think about remediation is a bit like when we've made miso or harnessed yeast to make wine. These are remediation processes. We're harnessing fungal metabolisms to transform something for us, and we do this a lot in vats and fermenters and jars, and we've done this for thousands of years. And so it's analogous with this mycoremediation. It's just that we have to find the right conditions for that. But because we can't set the conditions, because we're not inside the jar, of course we are inside the jar. The jar is just the environment. So we don't have the same level of control as we do when we're, say, fermenting a carboy of apple juice.
You talk in the book, there's a wonderful chapter where you look at various strategies of sort of applied mycology, if you will, including mycoremediation. I wondered if the different things you checked out, you did a lot of reporting in that chapter, what excited you the most of ways we might be using mushrooms to solve important problems?
The most exciting, I think, was mycofabrication, as using mycelium to build materials. And that was exciting because it's so far advanced. This is actually happening now. There's products. Dell ship thousands of servers a year in mycelial packaging. And IKEA are working on new ways to deal with packaging using mycelium. And so this is exciting because it's actually happening. And it disrupts so many polluting industries as well. And leather, this amazing leather-like material, which will... to grow 2 meters of leather, you have to have a cow. And for a cow, you have to have a field. To have a field, you have to cut down a forest. And to feed the cow, you've got to cut down another forest to grow the soybeans. To feed the cow. I mean, it's a terrible cycle of destruction to produce leather, and it takes forever to do that. So if you can grow this amount of leather on a waste material inside in 2 weeks, then you're doing good. So this was exciting to me because it was happening, and because it was really moving fast.
And what's the feedstock for something like that? If you're making leather or packaging, what do you have to feed these mycelium?
Usually agricultural waste, sawdust, corn stalks. There are these waste streams that you're just diverting a waste stream. That's one of the things that's so attractive about them. You have people who are producing this waste, agricultural waste, and it's a problem for them. You turn it into a solution for you, solve their problem. So win for them, win for you, win for the fungus. Because you're then cultivating the fungus to the exclusion of other organisms. So it's win-win-win, I think.
Sherilyn?
Yes. Anna asks, for Merlin, is there anything in your research that has surprised you the most about fungi, or what in your research?
I think the thing that surprised me the most was to find out that some fungi produce electrical impulses, action potential like impulses, and that these impulses are sensitive to stimulation, and the fungus probably is using these as a way to communicate across its network. This was astonishing thought to me, because not only did it make the fungus not only did it give the fungus a way to communicate on a short timescale, rapidly, much more rapidly than we would think if it was just using chemicals to flow from A to B through the network. But that these electrical communication systems might be just a much more fundamental part of life than we have normally thought. And I think this is definitely the case. It's been discovered in 2015 that these bacterial colonies use this kind of waves of electrical activity as well. So that just opened my mind to this thought that our brains have refined these techniques, but they didn't invent these techniques. Or rather, these techniques did not evolve in brains. They evolved before this and were refined through evolution in our brains. So that just broadened my thinking, as well as providing this whole new, surprising way of thinking about fungal networks.
Right. Another one, Michael?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. So Janet asks, she says, hello, Merlin. My 11-year-old son asked me if or how the ants that are taken over by the fungi stay connected to the fungi when they climb to the top of the plant. Are they still tethered, or do they go forth as a separate unit? If they are separate, how is that possible?
So the fungus stays connected to them because the fungus is inside their body. So as they walk, they're carrying around the fungus. The fungus is slowly digesting their insides, starts with their extremities, and it can disassemble their body in the most expert way. But they carry the fungus with them. They are becoming a walking fungus. People describe them as a fungus in ants' clothing. This is really the fungus is behind the driving seat, and it's hijacked an animal body to serve this need, because it doesn't have a twitchy muscular body. So it borrows one. So the fungus is inside it. The fungus slowly eats it. And then when the time comes to kill the ant, then the fungus runs through its whole body and digests it all, and becomes this mushroom-like structure that produces spores.
This, of course, prompts a certain phrase to come to mind: a fungus in human clothing. And maybe I'm looking at one.
It's a fun thought, isn't it? I always make this joke with Paul, that Paul Stamets, that he is, that there must be some fungus that has worked out how to convince him to
devote his life. Without question, he is a fungus in human clothing. I don't think he would object to that at all. Carolyn?
All right. Our very first question was from Amy, and she wrote, "It seems we live in a kind of metaphysically manifested default mode network. Limited by our categorical thought, we unintelligently address symptoms rather than foundational issues. How do we as a species, quote, shake the snow globe, unquote, to address problems, symptoms of this consciousness trajectory, spanning from climate change to mental health? How do we introduce a new language rather than offering one of empty analogies?" Michael, you're smiling.
Because I don't have to answer that
Go
question.
for it.
Merlin, it's all yours. I think she knows the answer, but or she has her own answer.
Well, I think there are lots of ways into this, aren't there? Because we live in such a world of interconnected issues and interconnected problems, and a solution over here might not be a solution over there. I think one of the big things we can do is tackle the most corrosive influences, the influences that lie at the bottom of so many of our problems, tackle those to take the pressure off us so that we're free to imagine and feel in different ways. And one of the big things at the bottom of our problems is unrelenting corporate greed, for example. If we could tackle this issue of unrelenting predatory greed, and everything that comes from that, then we would be alleviated from this pressure. We would be free to think in new ways and to imagine in new ways. So I think some of it's to do with tackling these forces that constrain us and which oppress us and force us to oppress others. And it's learning how to imagine in new ways, and that can happen in also. Some people have some people pray, some people dance, some people do yoga, some people do extreme sports, some people meditate, some people sing. All of these things help us to connect with the world that is more than us and help us to feel ourselves as part of a bigger story. And I think those are all ways that we can, again, learn to imagine in new ways. So yeah, I don't think there's a simple answer. Of course, there's not a simple answer, but I would say lots of problems, lots of solutions.
And I would add to that, you're talking about different modes of self-transcendence, right, or ego transcendence. And there are many different paths to that. Psychedelics is one, but as you say, dance is another, and extreme sports, and meditation and fasting. And we've developed all these technologies. In fact, your father just published a wonderful book on a whole suite of these techniques. But it's also the stories that people like Merlin tell. The stories that that are taking a certain perspective and looking at the world of nature, these natural facts, and using them to help us see our interconnectedness. It's not a fiction, yet there are different lenses, right? We once, nature read in tooth and claw, and the social Darwin approach, survival of the fittest, was based on science too, but it took you to a very different place. The beauty of studying what Merlin's studying is that you come out of it, and I felt this very much as I read the book, with your mind changed in some ways, that this is a book by virtue of the power of its writing, as well as the information in it, shifts your sense of the human. And in a way, what it reminded me of more than anything else was a novel. The last great book I read on nature till I got to Merlin's, which was The Overstory by Richard Powers, which uses trees and mycelial networks and the connections to kind of displace this human-centric view of things. And that's the beginning of a whole lot of changes that I do think end up with a shift in political point of view. Mm-hmm. Charlotte?
Great. Yes. Another synthesis question. In which ways do you think the information gleaned from the study of fungi will impact human life the most? And this touches on lots of different propositions that people have laid out. So just throwing you the general question.
Big one, and it's a hard question to do the most with because there are so many and all different. But fungi have impacted human lives hugely for as long as we've been human, and they've laid the ground for humans and animals like us to evolve. So it's a lot of the time it's a question of seeing what they're already doing. And one of the ways that I really see that is by thinking about decomposition. And you have these big biogeochemical cycles that spin, these slow timescales, fast timescales. Many of them are driven by fungi. So, for example, decomposition of wood, which returns a huge amount of carbon to the atmosphere and makes the space in which we can live. It makes the space that we can have air, a surface of the planet that we can exist in. We live and breathe in the space that decomposition is behind. And so in that sense, we see fungi by seeing where they aren't. They leave this negative of their actions. And so I think a lot of the question that's being asked is, could be answered by further uncovering these processes that fungi do, that fungi undertake, that they to see how our lives are impacted by them already. And then if we wanted to take it into an activist place or an action place, to start to harness those to shape our futures in ways that might help us overcome many of these crippling problems that we face. So broadly speaking, there are types of answers to this question like that, thinking about what fungi do, are doing already, and how that might change the way we think and feel. There are looking at fungi as a kind of instrumental sense in producing these applied solutions, like using fungal building materials or developing a mycoremediation protocol. And the one I really like doing as well, which is thinking about how these organisms work, and in doing so, change the way that we imagine, change the way that we think about ourselves, change the way that we think about the categories we use to organize the world. I think this is really big and doesn't get enough chat because it can sound a little woolly, but I don't think it's woolly at all. And I think we can really learn to exist on this planet in new ways by trying, not necessarily succeeding, but trying to understand organisms that live very different lives from this. So those three broad categories, I'd say, answers would fall into those categories, and I couldn't list them all.
Michael, how about you? How would you answer that question?
Well, I think it's a great question. And one of the questions it leads me to, and I'll throw it back to Merlin, is I'm curious how fungi are doing. We hear about mass extinction and we're usually hearing about animals and plants. It seems to me we're creating a world, and this is not a positive, very much to the liking of fungi, with lots of waste, lots of pollution, and lots of extinction, right? I mean, they are as you say, the great decomposers. We're giving them plenty to work on. So are fungi thriving in this world we're making, or are they also victims of what we're doing?
Both. And we don't know enough. So in 2018, there were 56 fungi listed on the IUCN Red List of threatened species, compared with tens of thousands of plants and animals. There are many more fungi than plants or animals. And so this is not a fair proportion. This proportion doesn't reflect the fact that fungi are totally fine. It just reflects the fact that we haven't actually gone around asking these questions of them. So the basic answer to your question is that we don't know nearly enough about how fungi are responding to changes in the global climate and environmental conditions. In the case of the decomposition, some decomposing fungi will do well. When you have more dead bodies, then certain fungi that eat those dead bodies, they're going to thrive. When the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs hit the Earth and caused this endless winter, or a very long winter at least, you had all these forests that just died, more or less, overnight. And so you have a global compost heap, and certain decomposing fungi have a great time in that kind of situation. Lots of fungi won't, of course, because there are many ways to be a fungus. This is a hugely diverse kingdom of life. So the relationships between plants and mycorrhizal fungi, because they are coupled, if the plants are struggling, then the fungi will often struggle too, because they have this obligate relationship with their plant hosts. In many cases, we are doing great damage to fungal networks in the soil by our agricultural practices, whether it's spraying fungicides which obviously would be a problem, or by putting on lots of inorganic fertilizers like nitrates, which disrupt this balance of exchange between plant and fungus. So we're doing huge damage to many fungi, and no doubt out of our damage will be many opportunities for many other types of fungus. So not one simple answer, and we really should know more. Given how important they are, given that we won't know what we're doing until we measure the effect of our actions on these organisms, we should really take fungal conservation more seriously. And people are starting to do this. There are lots of great networks of people. There's a great group called Fundación Fungi in Chile, and they persuaded the Chilean government to put fungi on their list of when you're doing a survey before you do a development or any kind of environmental change or transformation or disruption, you have to catalogue the fungi that are there. And so that means that fungi get put on the agenda.
Sherilyn, maybe time for one more and then I'll wrap it up.
Yes. So Sarah asked in the Q&A box, where do you recommend a citizen scientist starts their journey or adventure to fungi if they want to get involved in this movement on a grassroots level, no pun intended?
Great question. And there are lots of possibilities. I'd suggest getting a mushroom grow kit to start with. Then you can, and these are very easy to grow. You can, there's lots of places to get mushroom grow kits. So Back to the Roots is one. There are many others. And you spray these kits with water and the mushrooms will grow. You don't have to do very much at all, apart from be amazed at how fast they grow and how these immaculate forms come out of a amorphous lump of white, usually off-white material. So I'd start there, but that's just a beginning. You can learn about fungal techniques there's a great online mycology school run by someone called Peter McCoy called mycologos.world, and I'd suggest going there and maybe taking a course. And Peter has also got a great book called Radical Mycology, which has lots of amazing different ways to get into the fungal world in a hands-on way. So I'd start with cultivation and get to get a feel for the organism. It's all about having this feeling for the organism, and that you get by having them around. So that's where I begin, and then I go to mycologos.
I want to ask a somewhat related question as your last. I predict this book, Entangled Life, is going to inspire a great many young people to get into mushrooms and fungi, whether by growing them, as you suggest, or studying them. I can easily see how this will be one of those books that will inspire a generation to enter mycology. And I'd like you to just take a moment and address them for a minute. What are the big questions in the field that someone really ambitious and perhaps audacious could try to attack? Where should people go? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
For people who are into the very, very micro, there's a lot of questions to be answered about how basic fungal biology, how these cells extend and grow, how these cells know how and when to form networks, how to grow in this direction, how to withdraw, how do these fungal cells sense and respond, how do they coordinate themselves, how does this network coordinate its sprawling life? And these are big questions on the very basic cellular level. So people with that kind of interest will have a field day because these are wide open. Then on an ecological level, how do these networks, say mycorrhizal networks, how do these networks of fungi change the way that ecosystems work? How do these networks change the way that plants engage with each other in the field? We've had these experiments that have been done usually in closed greenhouse settings. We know very little about what's going on in the field, and this is where the really big questions are. It's very hard because we don't have techniques that make it easy, but developing techniques to study these behaviors outside would be a very, very big thing, and would help us understand and would transform our understanding of what's going on, because at the moment we're working usually by extrapolating to the field, and that's a fraught process. So I'd say that's a very big one. And then to have people who might not be scientists, who might be artists, who might be novelists, who might be dancers, to explore these unusual lives in every way that you use your imagination to create, in every way that you go about moving. If you're a dancer, how would it be to move if you didn't have a central nervous system? What would that feel like? That, I think, could be an enormously helpful process. What would it do to activists socially organize in network forms that don't necessarily have a head or a head of the organization, a head of the campaign? And we're seeing that already right now with a number of different activist networks, and it's really exciting. So I think there's lots of ways, whether you're a scientist or scientifically inclined or not. And I think that we'll learn as much from the creative, artistic, non-scientific ways of thinking through what it is to be a fungus as we will from the scientists. So I really hope that these inquiries can go in any and all of these directions, and they can also inform each other, just as one part of a fungal network and knows what's going on in another part of a fungal network.
I love that idea of using our brains to overcome our neurocentrism, because that's really what you're asking for. What a wonderful challenge to lay down before the next generation of mycologists. Well, thank you, Merlin. This has been incredibly enlightening, and I hope it encourages people to read your book, because it's such a rewarding experience. And I want to thank everyone in the audience for listening and participating, and I want to thank all our sponsors and partners, and Louie and Sherilyn and the whole team. And in a moment, you'll see a slide will come up, and it'll show you how to buy the Merlin's book, Entangled Life, if you haven't already. And just to remind you, you've been listening to Bay Area Book Festival Unbound. Thank you.
Thank you.